right. Hey, what's up, everybody? Good morning. Welcome back. Peachy says hello. It's about 2 minutes until 10, so just get comfortable, and in a few, we'll get today's Monday meeting out of the way. Hope you guys had a good weekend, wherever you're at right now, whatever you're doing. And yeah, just chill, and we'll be right there. Appreciate it. Good morning, Cordy. How's it going? Welcome back. Hi, everybody. Hi, Zoe, Kylie, everybody here. Hey, Sydney. Angel, Sebastian. Appreciate you guys attending and being up again. Hi, Nigel. Okay, so it's now pretty much 10 a.m. I'm going to just get things underway. So welcome back again, as usual. Good to see everybody. I know it's just the early few minutes of class, but as has I guess become our custom, make sure that you get a chance to tap a little comment into our live chat, and I'll just use that as my informal record of attendance. So make sure you get your comment in. Here's a question to just kind of get us jumping off. Did any of you guys notice the announcement that I sent last night with the first prompts for the essays? Let me know if you can confirm that made it through and delivered no problem. If so, then I'll just talk a little bit about that to get the meeting started and give you guys some guidelines on the paper. Okay, thanks, Cordy and others, for confirming that. So yeah, let me explain a little bit about the paper. I've got the prompt with me right here. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the guidelines, format, and what to expect, how to have a good, successful assignment. Okay, so what it says here, I'm just reading, good morning, is this. So it says you must write a 3 to 4 page essay. Sorry for the little typo, oops, but you should write a 3 to 4 page double-spaced essay on one of the topics below in 12-point font with normal margins. Okay, so notice that I changed the due date just slightly from what it was originally listed in the syllabus. In the syllabus, it indicated Monday, March 1st, and I just slid it over to Wednesday the 3rd. So essentially, I give you an additional 2 days to work. It's due in 16 days from today, so 2 weeks from this coming Wednesday. You may not consult any electronic resources whatsoever, no internet use at all, and the essay is worth 15% of your total grade. And then it shows the 2 prompts that you can report on. You have to choose one of those 2 prompts. You're not to write on both of them. There have been a few cases in the past where a student misread the directions and responded to both topics, but that would not be my intention, because then you would not have had enough space to really go into the detail you need for each of the different prompts. So just pick the one that you prefer and don't write on the other one. That's it. The 2 topics are basically both on the philosophy of religion material that we started the class with. And they ask you to choose between comparing and contrasting either the ontological argument and Pascal's wager. We're going to talk today about Pascal's wager, so hold your breath for that for a moment. But you can report on those 2, or if you like, you could report on the cosmological argument versus the argument from design, which we've kind of already finished covering by now. So depending on which 2 arguments you felt more comfortable with or found more interesting or just wanted to explain or analyze more, then you'll make your decision. So let me go back to the beginning of the prompt and just go over some of the basics of the format. So it says you have to write a 3 to 4 page essay double-spaced on one of these topics in 12-point font with normal margins. So first of all, 3 to 4 pages. If you feel that you need more space than 4 pages and you're reaching the end of that guideline of length, it's fine in my mind for you to go over and beyond the upper boundary. So if you need to like continue to a 5th or even 6th page, that's okay. No worries for that. But much more than that, you probably want to cut it yourself, because then it starts to approach more of like a term paper kind of length. And my intent was for this to be more of a focused topic essay of about a 3 to 4 page space, but a little more if you need it. So the upper boundary is soft. You can extend and go over it if you really need to for a few pages. The lower boundary, though, of 3 pages, I would not want anyone to go beneath that. Like, so, I mean, if you only wrote a 2-page paper or something, it's not going to be detailed enough to cover all of the information that the prompt asks about. So I'm just saying that with the 3 to 4 page guideline, the upper boundary is flexible, but the lower boundary is a little bit more hard, and you should try not to write a paper that is that much shorter than 3 pages. Okay, now next up, it says 12-point font with normal margins. That's just a basic guideline for you, and you have to stick with that. So the font has to be a 12-point font, meaning that I don't want you to make the font larger in order for there to be less content and still meet the minimum page length requirement. I also don't want it to be smaller for any reason. Just 12-point normal font. Double spaced, so that means do double spaced. Don't make the spacing bigger than double spaced. You see, as a professor, you got to imagine being in my position. Over the years, you see all kinds of different clever tactics that certain students would use to try and make the paper appear to be at least minimally long enough without having as much writing. So sometimes students will make the font bigger or the spacing larger, or extend the margins so that the text in the center is smaller. I'm just asking you to write the essay in a normal, standard way with the basic format that you see here. 12-point font, double spaced, and use the default margins in your word processor. Don't expand them. I always get questions when papers are given out about, is this supposed to be MLA, is this APA, and all that. I'll get to you, Dennis, don't worry. I'm gonna have, no, you won't use Canvas. You'll send it to me as an email. So, but I was just gonna mention that. But I was saying this thing too. Students ask about MLA, APA, and all that, and I never know what to tell people because it's not important to me. I mean, I've published work, and those guidelines to me are just kind of meaningless. So just stick with the format that you see here, and you'll be fine. 12-point font, normal margins, double-spaced essay. Don't make a huge header with like 10 items of information either. I don't like that because then it makes it so that your first page doesn't really start until halfway down the middle. So don't put like name, date, birthday, height, age, weight, you know, class number, student ID number, 20-point font, huge title, and then finally the essay starts way down lower. If you want to have all that information, then create a separate cover page, and then just have your first page of writing be at, you know, starting at the top. Okay, now Dennis, where do we submit the paper? Yeah, there's no assignment section on Canvas. That's on purpose. You just have to email it to me. So Vulich at Chapman.edu. I also teach at another institution. Vulich at Chapman.edu, the same email address that you see in the syllabus. You just want to send me your document anytime before class time on Wednesday the 3rd. So you can send it as a document file. Word file is usually the best, but I'll take PDF, Google Docs, Pages, as long as I can open it. Make sure there's no restrictions on my access to the document, and there shouldn't be a problem. Okay, so far so good, everybody. I'm just telling you a little bit about the format, basic stuff, font, spacing, margins, how to turn it in, when it's due. Now, of course, you can't consult any electronic resources at all. This paper is just supposed to be you, your actual physical textbook, and your notes, and your good common sense. So obviously these arguments have been discussed for thousands of years, and there's a wealth of information that people have written about online, but I don't care what any of those people have said. I only care about what you are writing connected by this book and the lectures in the class. So just, you're not permitted to use any source that you derive any kind of electronic information from. It has to just be the physical book. Pretend that you're writing this paper in the year 1950 and the internet doesn't even exist, and you have to just use a typewriter and your computer is just a glorified electronic typewriter. There's no such thing as the internet. There's no web browsing. You just deal with physical books, and you're writing based on the lessons you learned from a teacher and the book. So that's clear. I want to make that mention. It's an honest group, and I feel that at Chapman, it's already a pretty good, honest culture. So I don't get a lot of issues with plagiarism here, but occasionally it has happened, and I don't want you or me to be in that awkward position of dealing with the case. So let's not do that at all. Make sure you just write an honest paper. You don't have anything to worry about. I know you can do it. If you need help and you want me to look at a draft, as long as you can hit me with a draft with advance before the deadline, I'm happy to look at comments or give you comments and evaluate whatever people want me to look at. So I'm happy to help you as much as possible, but you do have to write an honest essay, so you can't submit any work that you found from any unapproved source, and the only approved source is the book. One other thing is this, you should at times in your essay include quotes and such from the book as support for your analysis and what you're reporting on. So when you do that, here's the only rule you need to know. Take any directly quoted passages and just place them in quotation marks. Then at the end of the quoted passage, please list the page number of the book where you found the quote from. And so that's it. You don't have to have a separate works cited or bibliography page. In a research type paper where they ask you to go and find different books, articles, materials, then you would have a bibliography, because the professor needs to know where did you get all the information that you did the paper on, that you wrote about. In this case, since you're only permitted the textbook itself, it would be, I think, unnecessary for all of us to have a works cited where every student, it says, here, the textbook is my works cited. I know you have the textbook, so I'll already, interpret that when you put a page number in a quoted passage within the body of the essay, that refers to the page number from our class textbook. Okay, so long story short, you're encouraged to use quotes in the book in your essay, or close paraphrases if it's not a verbatim quote, but very close to the language of the text. And you may also give a parenthetical page citation. All you have to do when you write a quote or you have a close paraphrase is give the page number in parentheses, and if you have any direct verbatim quotes, please enclose them in quotation marks. Okay, so far, I hope all this makes sense. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the style, too, of these kind of papers. So we've gone over just the format. Now I want to mention a little bit about style guidelines that are something important for philosophy writing. In a lot of the papers that you guys have been asked to write, throughout your schooling so far, it's mostly been in like English classes. And what they a lot of times emphasize are the classic parameters of the English essay format, like have a clear thesis in your intro paragraph, then have body paragraphs, and then have a summary of everything in the conclusion paragraph. But I believe that in philosophy, it's more important really the content of the body paragraphs. We really just care about the analysis, not all the stage setting and etc. So I would offer this to you as advice. You can either completely eliminate the classic intro paragraph where you have a thesis statement, or make it very brief and to the point and just jump into your body paragraphs quickly. I don't like, and I don't think it's necessary for you to have one of these long-winded, sweeping, poetic introduction paragraphs which connects the topic of this paper with all of human history and like the grand universe and all that stuff. Like, so if somebody says, God and man, the concept of religion, it's vexed minds for thousands of years. Some of the great minds have looked aloft to the heavens and asked some of the deepest questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Is there a God? Now it's 2021 and people are more socially diverse than ever. Saying all that stuff, and then finally now I'm going to talk about the ontological argument, and we're like done with the whole first page. So I'd like it if your actual paper is mostly all analysis and not just this stage setting, and you're not going to be graded based on the poetic quality of your prose. You're instead going to be graded on the accuracy of the analysis of the actual content of the arguments. So if you want to think about like the genre of writing in philosophy, especially modern day, today kind of philosophy, it's not at all like the poet or the novelist. It's more like the lawyer or the legal brief. You got to think of it being like, here's the aesthetic. It's cold, it's clinical, it's factual, it's direct, it's to the point. So you're laying out a case that an author gives for the conclusion that God exists. You're not trying to write a poem. You're not trying to write something beautiful or pretty. It's just cold, hard analysis. And that's the best way for you to approach the paper. So, a successful first paragraph could even just dive right into the argument, ontological argument, if that was your prompt, or if it was the cosmological argument, just go right into it. And you can say, St. Anselm in 1077 wrote the Proslogion. He wanted to prove that God exists. His argument's called the ontological argument, and here's how it goes. And you just start telling the reader about it. Okay, so just really dive into the arguments, focus on the analysis, and that'll take all of the space of the paper pretty much. When you get to the end, you don't have to have a conclusions paragraph that says, now here's what I just said and wasn't that interesting. You can just cut it after you have finished review of all the questions in the prompt. Okay, so now let me read these two prompts, and we'll also have a few things to say about each one. So if you write on the first prompt, that's ontological argument versus Pascal's wager. What it says is discuss the ontological argument and Pascal's wager and provide 2 objections to each. So first of all, you have to fully expose all the facts and content of the argument, how it tries to prove that God exists, and then when you've done both, keep in mind that Pascal's wager is going to be talked about today, so we'll have notes on that after today. But after you've explained one of the arguments, then you would give 2 objections to it. So there's a total of 4 objections in each of the papers. 2 objections to the ontological argument, 2 objections to Pascal's wager. With the ontological argument, I'm thinking of these objections studied in the class, like we studied Gaunilo, G.E. Moore, William Rowe. With Pascal's wager, there are objections that we will review this week as we go forward in our lecture series. After you've talked about the 2 arguments and the 2 objections of each one, the last part of the prompt says, is one of the arguments better than the other? If so, which one and why? And if not, why not? So that last part of the prompt is where you, the student, are being asked to report on which of the 2 arguments that you thought was the better one. So basically, in that case, it would be, was the ontological argument better, more persuasive, more plausible to you, or was Pascal's wager the better of the 2 arguments? Whichever one you thought was better, you would give the philosophical explanation why, and then you would finish your paper right there. Now, when you tell me which of the 2 arguments is better, you have to give a philosophically justified reason. You can't just say something arbitrary like, well, St. Anselm, he lived in the 11th century, and that's just a more interesting century than Pascal's lived in the 17th. Like, it has to be about the argument and the content of the argument. It can't be like, I like the one guy's name more than the other guy, so I like his argument better. It has to be about why you thought the reasons and information given in the argument were more persuasive to the conclusion. Now, some people, though, will say, I didn't think either argument was better. They were both equally weak or equally strong, so I couldn't pick a winner. Okay, well, that's fine. If you don't think one was better than the other, then you have to also explain and justify that reaction. So you're either going to think one was better or you're not. If one was better in your mind, tell me which one and tell me why you think so. If you thought neither was the better argument, that's an interesting response, and tell me then why you found each one to be equally deficient or whatever the case is. Okay, so that's prompt number 1. Now, prompt 2, if you choose to write on it, is just like prompt 1, with the only difference being that we substitute 2 different arguments to report on. So in case you do prompt 2, you could choose between the cosmological argument and the argument from design. And so, you know, we've reported and analyzed those. The cosmological argument, the one that says the universe has to have a cause, and the only thing it could be would be something that's not contingent, so that has to be God, necessary being. The design argument, which says that if something exists with purpose or function, like say a watch, it had to have an intelligent architect that designed it. And so what about the things that are in nature that have all kind of complexity and purpose, like the eyes or the ears or anything else? So they must have a maker. So we've looked at those 2 arguments. You would go back into them, explain them, maybe cite some text quotes, and then provide 2 objections to each. The objections to those arguments are best found in the writing of Ernest Nagel and his article, Does God Exist?, that we're going to briefly now just finish up at the top right here. And again, the last part of the prompt, is one of those arguments better? If so, which one and why? If neither was, tell me why not. Okay, guys, so I mean, that's all I really wanted to say for now. I wanted to make sure to open today's meeting with a nice discussion of those prompts so that we're all on the same page. You got plenty of time to work on them, and they'll be due Wednesday of the March 3rd. Let me know, are there other questions about it for now that I could answer while we're all together? If so, go ahead and type them in and I'll see them. If not, then that's okay. And if anything comes up in your mind subsequent to this, you can always email me and we can just talk about it, through email. But yeah, I guess that's really it. So that's your first essay assignment. It's due in 16 days. It's worth 15% of your grade. And after we're done with that, we'll be looking forward to the midterm as we continue, going through our lecture series in the syllabus. Okay, guys, so sounds good then. So now let me go back over some of the last remaining topics in the paper of Ernest Nagel that we were finishing last time. When I left you guys, I believe that we were at the point in his essay where he was discussing these two miscellaneous arguments for God's existence. One of them was the argument from the unfairness of the world without God, and then the other one was the argument from religious experience. So I'm just going to quickly talk you through those to catch us up a little bit. I don't think there's much more I need to say about them, but the first one, which I call the argument from the unfairness of the world, it says that if God didn't exist, then the world would be too unfair, and that just cannot be the case, so there must be a God. The way the argument functions is that it says, if there's no God, then imagine the case of people who are good people that have done nothing wrong, but they suffered. So like obviously you guys know, and it's a sad thing, but bad things can happen to good people, and that does happen. People getting tortured, raped, little kids getting shot for no reason. I mean, some terrible, despicable things happen in the world, and it sometimes happens to people that didn't do anything wrong. So when bad things happen to good people, that doesn't seem fair. If there was a God, though, he could reward those people by sending them to heaven in the afterlife and giving them their heavenly reward. Take the other case. Sometimes there are bad people in life that enjoy all the best things that life has to offer, living their best life, but they're evil people, hurting others, committing crimes, maybe even murder, etc. So what happens if a bad person prospered and never suffered throughout their life at all? Well, that doesn't seem fair either. That good people can suffer and bad people can prosper. So if there's a God, then he could also rectify this injustice, I guess, by either denying the bad person with the reward of heaven in the afterlife or even punishing them with hell. If there's no God, though, then there's no mechanism to reward the good and punish the evildoers if they didn't receive their just deserts in life. So the argument says there must be a God to secure that kind of guarantee of divine cosmic justice. The problem with the argument, though, and now I'm speaking in the voice of Nagel because he's the critic of these arguments. The problem, he thinks, is that the crucial assumption behind the argument is that the universe is actually fair, and it's only fair on the assumption that there's a God there to punish those that deserve it and reward those that deserve it. But absent the assumption that the world is fair, the argument falls apart. And so he simply points out that we don't have any kind of right to assume that the world is fair just because it seems like an optimistic projection of human hopes. Certainly we would hope that there's, a reward for the good and a punishment for the bad, but just because we would like for this to be the case in an ideal universe, there's no established proof of it. In fact, to the contrary, many people hold this as a truism. Life isn't fair. Have you ever heard your parents or, other members of your community say that to you to try and teach you a lesson like, hey, you think everything's going to be fair and just, then you're going to be disappointed. Life's not fair, get used to it. So this argument runs counter to that everyday truism. No, actually everything is fair, and God is the one that guarantees that it is in the biggest picture. Well, if we didn't assume this, and if we don't think we're entitled to assume it, then the argument doesn't have force. Now, one more miscellaneous argument for God's existence, also mentioned at the tail end of the meeting last lecture, was called the argument from religious experience. Okay? Some people hold that God exists not because of like a theoretical argument like the kind that we've all studied, but instead because of a very powerful personal experience where they thought God showed themselves to them in that experience. It could be prayer, meditation, a brush with death that they survived. They thought they saw a miracle happen. They just had a transcendent moment where all of a sudden they're like, God is revealing himself to me. So in these kind of experiences, some people think that God's reality is revealed to them, and then they'll refer to that experience when others ask them, why do you believe in God? And they say, well, something happened to me, and when I had that experience, it showed me God revealed himself to me, and now I know he exists. Okay, so argument from religious experience, everybody. It's based on vivid, powerful, personal experiences that people have where they think God showed that he exists to the person somehow. I don't want to be overly specific about what they are. That's why I describe them in variety of terms. Like it could be someone thought a miraculous event happened, or they just felt like a communion with a higher power while they were meditating or praying. Or it could be a brush with death. Whatever the case is, though, sometimes people claim these religious experiences as their primary reason for the belief in God. Now, what's wrong with this as an argument, though? Because again, Nagel has criticisms. Well, he says there's two main issues with this type of argument. First of all, the evidence that is given is a person's experience. And that's something that cannot be given to other people so that they can also evaluate it on their own. Usually, you think you have good evidence when you can give it to others that they can also inspect and verify. So like, suppose I'm making a case in a court of law that so-and-so Smith is the murderer. I can't just go up there and say, hey, he's the murderer, let's get this over with. I have to have evidence. And so what if I tell the jury, here's an exhibit. Look at this photo, everyone. Don't you see on this photo there's a footprint recovered from the crime scene, and it matches this shoe print of a shoe that he's known to have worn. So I'm offering that to you as evidence. Take a look at it. The jury looks at it and they maybe make their decision. Well, in this case, the person arguing that God exists on the basis of the religious experience, they cannot offer the experience to someone else. They can't say, look, if you don't believe me, just check it out. Here it is. Evaluate it and tell me what you conclude. So the argument is only as convincing as the evidence, but here we have evidence that cannot be given to another person. It's forever relegated to the realm of your own memories and your own psychology. So that's one issue. The evidence cannot be exhibited. And then another problem is this. Even if we claim the person's experience was in some sense authentic, it doesn't necessarily mean, according to a skeptic, that it came from a supernatural being like God. There will always be like a non-supernatural explanation of the same claimed experience that makes no mention of God or the divine. So someone could say, okay, you claimed a religious experience, but I think you were on drugs, or I think that you were sleep deprived, or I think that you were going through a psychotic episode, or maybe a manic episode, or maybe you were suffering from hallucinations that were brought about by withdrawals or something. So there's always going to be some ability that a skeptic would have to give a non-religious explanation of the same claims. So those are the two issues with the religious experience argument, according to Ernest Nagel. Number one, that it's based on evidence that cannot be publicly observed. And then number two, the claims of the divine aspect can always be given an explanation that's not related to religion. Now, when you think about arguments, you only really give arguments to convince people that don't already agree with you. So like there'd be no reason to walk up to someone and be like, hey, the world's round. What do you say? Like, here's my argument. They'll be like, yeah, I already agree with you. So thanks, but we agree. Well, when you make an argument to convince someone that's not already convinced, how are you going to give them a convincing argument in this way if it's based on religious experience? If you talk to another theist and you say, I believe in God because I had a religious experience, they may say, I had one too, and so we agree. But to a skeptic who evidently hasn't had such an experience, it's not going to be a very good argument if you can't give them reasons. If you just say, hey, I had an experience, then the skeptic is left wondering, did they really have one, and how can they prove it? So that's his problems with the religious experience, or sometimes mystical experience argument, they call it. Okay, now one more thing before we move on completely from Nagel. This is me just finishing up his notes. He also talked at the end about what's called the problem of evil. Okay, so far to this point in the class, we've really only looked at arguments that attempt to prove that God exists, and then combined with objections to those same arguments, right? We have not yet looked at anyone trying to make an argument for the opposite conclusion, that God does not exist. And so now finally, Ernest Nagel is going to mention one of those. This is a very classic argument that goes back at least 1,000 years, long considered kind of a thorn in the side of the church. In fact, there's a whole genre of refutations in medieval Christian literature called theodicies that try to rebut the problem of evil argument. So it's a persistent and well-known, recognized argument for atheism. And just so we have that balance and we cover everything in Nagel's paper, I want to talk about it. So at the end, he mentions this argument, the problem of evil. In logic and philosophy, when we write arguments out, we often do them in what's called standard form. And standard form looks visually kind of like this on the page. You have a conclusion of the argument at the bottom, and that's the statement that you're trying to prove. Above that, divided by a horizontal line, you have the premises listed above. And the premises are the reasons or the evidence that's supposed to back up and justify the conclusion. So problem of evil has two premises that lead to this conclusion. The first premise says that if God existed, then there would be no evil in the world. Okay, first premise. It's an if-then. If what? If God existed, well, and then in that case, there wouldn't be evil in the world. The second premise, though, merely just adds the statement that, but there is evil in the world. Okay, so from these two premises, the conclusion that appears to follow logically would be the statement that God does not exist. Okay, so this conclusion is derived from the two premises. Let me try, and I will try my best to just give the argument some plausibility by going through each premise and explaining what it's saying. So line by line, let's start at the top. First premise, premise 1 says, if God existed, then there would not be evil in the world. Okay, now, why do you think somebody would say this? What is it about God, according to the common understanding that people have of him? What is it about God that some, anyway, would think that that would rule out the possibility of evil? Why would anybody think that if there's God, there couldn't be evil? Because God, they thought, was supposed to be how? Let me see in the chat if you can kind of get a sense of what I'm hinting at here. What feature, quality, attributes, etc. of God would be thought of as the reason that he couldn't allow evil, or that there would not be evil in case he existed? Basically, I'm asking you, why would somebody make the claim of premise 1 here? Okay, good, that he's all good. And Cordy, you've also mentioned something important, that he's omnipotent. Right. Those are the two attributes of God that are supposed to eliminate the possibility of there having any evil. And so let me explain a little more. Omnibenevolence means infinitely good, like good to the maximum infinite amount, like righteous, just, divinely benevolent. So if God is perfectly good, then he would be motivated for there not to be any evil, because evil is the contrary of good. So a being that's perfectly good would be set against evil. And then omnipotence means that you have infinite and unlimited power. So put those two pieces together. If you have all infinite goodness, then you would not want evil. And if you had infinite power, then you also would have the ability to do something about it. You would be able to stop it at any moment merely through your will, because you have unlimited power. So you would think that a being that has all the goodness and all the power would both not want there to be evil and would be able to do something about it at any time. So in other words, there shouldn't be this evil if you have a being that holds all power and is set against evil. But nonetheless, premise 2 just mentions that there is evil in the world, and we've kind of had mention of what some of those examples are, school shootings, people getting tortured, raped, jailed without having committed a crime. In some cases there could have been a false conviction. So anyway, there's bad things that happen in the world that we could call evil. If there was a God, though, there would not be any of that. So the conclusion of the argument is then there must not be a God. If there was, there wouldn't be evil. But of course there is. So there must not be any such thing as a perfectly good, perfectly powerful being. Now that's the argument, if you can kind of just grasp the essentials of it. Nonetheless, as throughout the whole semester, we always look at both sides of every argument. And there are certain reasons to object to this. I don't know, do any of you have a sense of where you might try to lodge an objection against this? Or do you think the argument's just bulletproof? Like, what do you think is a possible reason to find fault with this? I'm not saying you've thought it out completely, but maybe someone has some ideas. Is there anything wrong with the claims made by the argument? Is there any room for a person to reject any of the claims in the argument here? Because if you accept both the premises, then it looks like the conclusion follows. So I guess the place to sort of find an objection would be to refuse to accept certain of the premises. But what do you think? Okay, Cordy, I'm looking at your comment here. You say, I think maybe the free will argument fallen from grace or whatnot within the church. Okay, an interesting point. And I guess I would, if I'm arguing against this, am I the devil's advocate? I guess I'm God's advocate in that case. So yeah, in line with what you're saying here, some people make objection to premise 1, they'll say, well, God does exist and he's perfectly good and perfectly powerful, but the fact that there's evil has nothing to do with him. It issues from the bad moral decisions of human beings that he granted free will. And you could argue that in the big picture, giving us a measure of free will, consistent with the ability to do things that are wrong, is a greater good than allowing us to not have such freedom of the will, restricting us to the morally righteous actions, but not giving us the power to choose on our own. I understand that argument, and you can even link it to aspects of the Old Testament scriptures. In Genesis, it says that we were supposed to be in paradise, and then Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, tempted by the serpent, and then there's the fall of man, and then man has to work by the sweat of his brow, woman give birth in labor. That's the scriptural explanation. But philosophically, it doesn't settle all the problems, I would say, Cordy. If you really wanted to be a little bit more critical, right? You could say, well, wouldn't God have had already the knowledge through his omniscience that through the temptation Eve would eat from the apple? Why even place the tree of knowledge there and tempt them with the serpent if it would have been inevitable that this action would have ultimately been taken? And furthermore, even if we had free will, I think we do, I've always considered it, this is just me kind of riffing on my own, but I have to teach this so much that I think of all the little possible ins and outs of the argument, right? And oftentimes that's a common student rebuttal. Don't we have free will? And so free will is a good thing, even though sometimes it leads to bad outcomes that are morally wrong. Well, one issue with that is that not everything bad that happens in life on this planet is the result of human free will. Like if you just, if an earthquake happens and a sinkhole swallows up your house, or you just get struck by a lightning bolt, that's not a human decision that led to that. But setting those cases aside, even with the existence of free will, I kind of wonder about, why is it that having free will necessarily means that people really have to do things that are bad and wrong? Like, I have free will, and so do you, to do terrible things that I would hope you will never do, and that I, of course, will never do, right? So, just knowing that, like, in theory, I could go out and commit a horrible crime doesn't mean I'm motivated to do it or that I want to do it. So I'm sitting here right now with the free will to kill people, and I'm not going to do it. So how come when people say humans have free will, that somehow leads to the conclusion that they're really going to do bad things? Couldn't people have free will and just be tempted by doing bad things and not actually do them? I could see that as a completely consistent way of things going. People could have even read books and watched movies where fictional characters commit terrible actions. And they look at them and they're like, man, we could do that, but I would never do that. Just like when you watch movies where people steal cars and kill others and stuff, you're like, I will never do those things, although it's possible and some people do them. So I'm never 100% convinced on the claim that free will is necessarily, certainly going to cause bad behavior. I could have imagined God giving us free will and having knowledge and insight into what the bad behavior could have been, but just we wouldn't want to do it. I don't know. Just thinking. So, Cordy, you also say it defers that responsibility on humans, but there are countless examples of tragedy among good people, and then there's also that point. Sydney, could an objection be that there has to be evil in the world, or else there would just be heaven? Something along those lines. Well, I don't know. Couldn't the idea or the concept of evil have been in the mind without it actually having materialized? If you go back to the story of Genesis, doesn't it seem like God's original intent was for man and Adam and Eve to live in paradise? So why couldn't he have just stuck to the original plan? I guess, again, we get into the issues of Scripture because of the temptation of Eve by the serpent. The whole temptation, though, has got its own puzzles and paradoxes involved, right? Like, why did he have to do that, knowing full well what would happen in the end? And also, here's something that's always been a little bit weird to me. Why is it that eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge is like the big bad thing? Knowledge is not in and of itself a bad thing, I would argue. So is this like somehow laced together with theology, that if you're in the pursuit of knowledge outside of the realm of Scripture and the Bible, you're on the path to like sin or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, these are just issues to consider. Now, what does actually Nagel say in reply to those objections? He's heard these objections, and he has a couple of points. So I'm just going to say them and move on. To anybody who says, well, is there really evil, or is it all for the best? You think there's evil, but it's just because you have a limited perspective. If you could back up and see everything from God's point of view, then you'd see that what you think of as evil is really all for the best. It gives us the ability to strive to overcome, our flaws and to become better people, to move past the tragic outcomes and to seek a better choice or life for ourselves. So maybe, like what we are saying, evil is just kind of an illusion created by the up-close point of view we have on things. Well, what Nagel says back to that is that even if evil is an illusion, even if it's just the appearance of evil, even apparent evil, he says, is still not as great as it could have been in this world, right? So he's still questioning that. And on top of that, he says, imagine yourself trying to console somebody suffering really badly in life by saying, hey, really, don't worry, God's got you. It's all for the best. I know you're in a torture chamber and you didn't really do anything wrong. You're being persecuted by this like murderous regime somewhere. But, you know, God has a plan and it's all for the best. He says it would be kind of cold comfort to someone suffering through even what we are calling an illusion of evil, if that's what it is. And then one more thing. He says, why is it that we would hope for the appearance of evil to be an illusion and it's really all for the best? Don't we have just the same evidence of the opposite, that whatever appears to be good and righteous and just is an illusion and it's actually all for the worst, you know, and the universe is ruled by like an evil overlord that's just setting you up with hopes and optimism so that he can dash those hopes later? This would be a cynical and a pessimistic outlook, and I hope none of us really have that way of looking at reality. But he says there's just as much evidence as there is for the other more optimistic perspective that what appears evil is really for the best. So he sees this as being a little bit more, again, as a projection of human hopes and dreams rather than something that can be clearly justified on the available evidence. So good comments and questions all around. But we do have to move on a little bit now from the Nagel. So I'm going to start getting us some notes for the next author in the series. And this is important for anybody who is thinking of maybe writing on prompt number 1. Dennis, I know I've heard a lot of objections regarding the Bible and arguing what is right and wrong with the scripture. Yes, there's a whole host of objections that take us more, you know, into the nitty-gritty details of scriptural interpretation, but I don't want to like necessarily lean too heavily on those, because this is not to presuppose that a person in this class or studying philosophy is necessarily conversant with Christian scripture or, you know, like the Quran or, you know, like the Torah of Judaism. So I'm speak from a level of general knowledge myself and academic knowledge, but I wouldn't want to dive into more of the scriptural back and forth, because I feel that that starts to become too closely connected to just one of the major monotheistic religions. But no, that's a fair point for sure, Dennis. So yeah, next up, and I was saying that if anyone wants to write on the first prompt, the following piece of notes and discussion would be important, because the first prompt asks you to compare and contrast the ontological argument with Pascal's wager. Now we're going to learn about Pascal's wager. Okay, so this is the name of the author. Interesting name, Blaise Pascal. Okay, so this is a French philosopher of the 17th century. He lived from 1623 to 1662. And so you can see he had a kind of short life, just 39 years, but he had a very important life. He was a mathematician, scientist, and a theologian, philosopher of religion. So he had a lot of diverse academic interests. He wrote a lot of stuff, and there was a book that was published of his notes, but it was only published after he died. So in 1669, posthumously, this book called Pensées was published by Blaise Pascal. And that's a French word, which just means thoughts. So his book, Pensées, thoughts in English, it holds within it this argument that we're now going to examine, which is called the wager. And today, it's called Pascal's wager. So if you looked it up, you're going to see a lot of people refer to it as Pascal's wager. In his original book, though, since he's Pascal himself, he just calls it the wager. And that's what it's called in our textbook as well. The Wager by Pascal, aka Pascal's wager. All right. So just setting us up to get the discussion started with the author's name, his dates, publication, and title. Okay, so now let's get into it. The first thing I would tell you about this argument is that he has a bit of a different approach from some of the other authors that we've looked at. Because whether it was Anselm or Taylor or Paley, you know, they're trying to directly prove that God exists. Pascal says right away at the beginning, I'm not going to do that. He says, I'm not going to try to make an attempt to prove that God exists. And here's why he says this. He says the reason is because no one could prove it, and no one could disprove it. Because if he exists, he's way beyond the limitations of the human mind to understand. So Pascal says that it would actually be foolish to even attempt to make a proof of God's existence. He thinks in a way that it's kind of not fair when people criticize Christians and others if they don't have a solid argument to back their belief up with. He says it actually makes perfect sense that they don't have such an argument, because many people could recognize that even attempting to give one would almost be like disrespectful of God, as though you could prove the existence of a majestic infinite being that's way beyond your powers of comprehension. Wouldn't it be a little bit more modest and humble to say, I can't prove this, but I believe anyway? So he says, I can't prove it, nor can you, nor can anybody, so let's not even try to go down that road. Instead, he says, I'd rather like to offer you an argument as to why you should just choose to believe in God, even though it can't be proven or disproven. Okay, so he says, think about it like this. Think about it as somewhat parallel to the choice that you face when someone asks you to wager on the flip of a coin. Okay, now let me explain the somewhat rough similarities here. When somebody flips a coin, right, what do you know? Well, you know that the coin's going to land, and it's going to land on either heads or it's going to land on tails. It won't land on both, but you don't know until the coin has landed which side it's going to be. Okay, so if someone says, hey, pick heads or pick tails, let's bet, and then they flip, you make your choice. At that point, you don't know which one it's going to be, but you've committed to making a pick. Now he says, in the same kind of way with the existence of God, given what he's claimed so far, no one, he thinks, could ever know which side of the coin it is, as it were. Is it that he exists or doesn't exist? We don't know, and he says we can't know, but we do know this, just like with the coin flip, even though you don't know in advance which particular face will show, you do know for a fact that it's going to either be what or what. Let me see if anybody can finish that thought. So tell me what this either or statement is that I'm hinting at. According to Pascal, nobody can know specifically whether God exists or doesn't exist, but 100% we know that either what or what. He either does or doesn't what. Let me see if you can get that. Well, no, not Angel if you win or lose, but that's in the ballpark. I'm asking this question. He says, none know whether God exists or not, but you know for a fact that either he blank or does blank. Yeah, that he either exists or doesn't exist, correct. So that's an either or statement. Let me put it here. None can prove whether God exists or not. But despite this, we know for sure that he either exists or does not exist. Okay, that he either does or doesn't. In logic and grammar, an or statement is called a disjunction. So if I say like I'm either going to like eat pizza or tacos, that's a disjunction which says either on the one hand I'll eat pizza or on the other hand I'll eat tacos. Now with this disjunction, it says either God exists or does not exist. For any disjunction which claims that either something is the case or its negation, that is a necessary truth. Like another example, I don't know sitting here right now whether aliens exist in outer space. Like I don't know definitively if they do or don't. But I know this much, that they either do or don't, and it can't be both, right? If there's some of them out there, then that's the case. And if there's no such things out there, then that is the case. One of these two things exactly is the case, and it cannot be that they both exist but also don't exist, which would be a logical contradiction. So here's something that he says we can take home and know for sure. Not that God exists, not that God doesn't exist, but that he either does or doesn't, okay? So in the same way as with the coin flip, I'm telling you I'm going to flip a coin. You don't know whether it's going to be heads or tails yet, but you know that it will definitively be one of the two when it lands. So your question then is just now, will you choose to believe or choose not to believe, since you're being asked to wager on this kind of either or question? Now, the next part of our little discussion here would just walk us through the ways of winning or losing a coin flip bet. So I just want you guys, if you can, with the last few minutes here, to follow me and draw a box, okay? And inside the box, we're going to draw a cross so that there's 4 quartiles in the box. Now, this is going to be a Punnett Square, which will be a diagram to show all the ways of winning or losing a normal coin flip wager. In the top two vertical columns, I'm going to place the two outcomes that could happen from the coin flip. So one of the outcomes could be that it lands heads. And of course, the other alternative outcome could be that it doesn't land heads, but it lands tails. Now over here, in the two left horizontal rows, I'm going to draw the two possible betting stances that the wagerer can take. So when it's a coin flip, obviously, what's one of the positions that you can take? You could pick one or the other side. So one choice is you pick heads. And the other choice could be obviously to pick tails instead. So, all right. Notice now that within each of the four boxes in the square, we will coordinate an outcome of the wager with a betting stance. Okay, so like box 1 stands for having picked heads and heads landed. So I'm going to draw a W or an L in each of the four boxes within to designate whether that combo of result and choice would result in a win or a loss. So clearly, if you pick heads and heads is the result, you won. If you pick heads but tails landed instead, then that was a loss. And again, if you picked tails but heads was the face that showed, you have lost. And if you pick tails and tails was the face that shows, then that's a win. So there's two ways to win and two ways to lose with a normal coin flip wager. You can win by picking heads when heads shows, or you can win by tails if you picked it and that shows. And you can also lose with two possible mismatches, picking heads with tails landing or picking tails with heads landing. So now, this graph just gives you a sense of the logic of the choice situation facing you when you have this kind of like two outcome betting stance. Now, what we will do as we finish the essay and the notes on Wednesday, I'm just leading you up to this, we'll redraw the diagram, but now with respect to the current wager that we really have looming large as to whether to believe in God or not. So as before, instead of landing heads or landing tails, remember that there was no such thing as God. So one, like heads landing, as it were, is God exists. The other, God does not exist. Okay, and then in this case over here, your two betting stances, it's either to believe in God or not believe in God. And I'm going to hold you in suspense a little bit because I know we're running low on time. But as I fill in these four boxes, I just want you to consider for a moment what will be the winnings and the losses possible in each of the four combinations of outcome and bet. If you believed in God and God exists, that's a win. But we'll continue on Wednesday. Ask yourself, what is the win if you believe in God and he really was real? If you believe in God and there was no such thing, then you didn't win. But question to contemplate between now and Wednesday, what did you lose though, if anything, if you believed and you were wrong? Now the other side of the coin. Suppose you didn't believe in God, but actually, oops, there was such a thing as God. So that would not be a win, that would be a loss. But what would be the result for you in case you didn't believe and it turned out that God was real? And then finally, one more possible combination. A person doesn't believe, and yes, they're right, there is no God. Well, then they were correct. We could call it a so-called win in the coin flip model. But what's one, if anything? Okay, and based on the evaluation of these outcomes, the author Pascal will conclude that it's just a way better, safer bet for you to believe. And maybe you can already sort of anticipate why he's saying that. But if not, I'll clarify it even more on Wednesday. So I think that's all we had time for today, guys. I know we're a little like 2 minutes beyond our normal class time. I don't want to hold you in case you have a next meeting to get to. But let me know in the chat or just by hitting the like button or anything else that you're good to go. And if so, I'll just be signing off and we'll be in touch by email or anything else between now and Wednesday. Everything's good, guys? Are we all right? Let me see. Okay, thanks so much again. I really appreciate you guys' continued attendance and focus on the class. I'll certainly see you guys back in a couple days then, so enjoy your President's Day and take it easy. I'll see you then.